right, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the first webinar in the Spring Summer Science Series that is being brought to you by the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center and the South Atlantic Blueprint team. In this series, we're going to be highlighting projects from the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center that are especially relevant to landscape scale conservation in the South Atlantic region. So for those of you who are used to tuning into the South Atlantic Third Thursday Web Forum, this is also our April Third Thursday Web Forum. And those of you who are regulars on that series will probably recognize me. My name's Hillary Morris, and I work on user support and communications for both the South Atlantic and Southeast Conservation Blueprints. So very glad you all have joined us today. Here's what to expect from today's webinar. We'll start out just by going over some meeting logistics and then introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Frank. He's going to present for 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end before we wrap up with a quick preview of the future presentations that we have lined up for the rest of this webinar series. So I'm going to hand it off to Carrie Furness with the Climate Adaptation Science Center to say a few additional words of welcome and explain the logistics for our webinar. And briefly, I want to say a big thank you to you, Carrie, and Ashlyn Shore as well for your help setting up this webinar and doing a lot of the publicity. Thanks again for that. So Carrie, I will hand it off to you.
Great. Thanks, Hillary, and hello, everyone. Let me add my welcome on behalf of the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center to this webinar. We're really glad for the opportunity to partner with the South Atlantic Conservation Blueprint team to present some of the science sponsored by the Southeast CASC to this combined group of interested users. And we're really excited for the participation of you all in this. So like just to quickly cover some of the features of the Zoom interface that we're using for the webinar. So as noted on the slide, the controls at the bottom left of your Zoom interface allow you to connect to the audio using either your computer or via phone. And if you're hearing this, you've already done that. But this also allows you to mute and unmute your line and also to perhaps inadvertently start your video. So we're going to keep all lines muted during the presentation and ask that you keep your video also off so that we can lessen distractions during Steve's presentation. In the middle of the bottom bar, you can also access the chat window, and I'd encourage you, if questions come up during the presentation, to go ahead and submit them in the chat for discussion after the talk, but we'll likely be able to unmute lines and let people ask questions by audio as well. So, and a note for those who might be joining us only by phone, *6 is the code to mute and unmute your phone. So lastly, we're going to be recording the webinar, and you can access the recording afterwards in a couple of places. Hillary plans to post it to the calendar event on the South Atlantic LCC website, as she usually does. And we will also post it on our Science Series webpage on the Southeast CASC website. So now back to Hillary to introduce our speaker.
Great, so our presenter today is Dr. Steve Frank. You can see his smiling face on the webcam, hopefully. Hi, Steve. He's a professor in the Department of Entomology and Plant Pathology at NC State University. And members of his lab study many aspects of how urbanization affects tree health and ecosystem services, which includes learning how the urban heat island effect can change innocuous native herbivores into damaging invasive tree pests, and how exotic trees can affect arthropod biodiversity. In addition, they study how urbanization affects bird communities and the predation services they provide. So Steve, take it away. I'm gonna stop sharing here and hand that over.
All right. Let's see. All right. We're good to go?
Good to go. Can see you and hear you.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming. Thanks for the invitation to share this work, Carrie and everyone. I'll give you a sort of a taste of some of the work that we've been doing in my lab in relation to a Southeast Climate Science Center project that we've had for a couple of years and finished up. And you know, we do lots of different things that I'll be glad to talk about afterwards, or if you see something you're particularly interested in and want to chat offline, feel free to email me. My website is on the slide here, and some of the papers that I reference and more information you can find on there. All right. Oh, so I'm not able to advance my slides. Here we go. All right, so we study trees and forests, and particularly trees and forests that are affected by urbanization, which is a primary global change factor. And an important thing to consider is that, you know, forests of the future generally will be smaller. We're actually getting a greater number of forests in the US, of deciduous forests, but they're getting smaller and smaller in size. And this is due to fragmentation, primarily due to urbanization, also some agricultural activities and other things. But you can see a large majority of the number of forests in the US are less than 50 hectares. And this accounts for about 20% of total forest area. So these are the forests that we study. And the forests of the future will not only be smaller, but they'll also be hotter. And this is obviously due to general climate warming, but also as forests are fragmented by urban areas or roads, they become hotter because of the urban heat island effect. And so can you guys see my cursor? Well, in any case, on the right, yes, okay. On the right-hand side of the screen, we have some urban forest fragments and a Landsat image on the left-hand side of the screen, just showing how forest size and the urban situation that it's in can affect the internal temperature of those forests. And so the smaller one up here, letter C, is a couple of degrees hotter in the center than larger forests like letter A there. And so we're interested in how urbanization and climate change affect forest health, and primarily the trees in those forests and the arthropods and other animals that live in there. And so we study abiotic effects, primarily temperature and drought. Biotic effects on forest health in our lab focus primarily on tree pests, and we consider conservation goals, including the diversity of arthropods like bees and predatory beetles and lots of other things, and birds and all those kinds of things. So our study systems are urban and rural forests. We focus on red maples and willow oaks in a lot of our work that you'll see today, but also today with the work we've done on this project, we used a lot of other tree species, including several native and exotic oak and maple species. The pests we study are primarily scale insects and lots of other things, but scale insects are weird. You can see in this picture of the twig on the bottom right, lots of little great bumps on that red maple twig. And under each of those bumps is a insect called a scale insect, and they suck fluids out of trees. And then biodiversity, again, we focus on arthropods and birds so far in our lab. So how does urbanization affect forest health and services? A lot of the work that we're doing in forests, we're working in collaboration with folks at University of Delaware and the US Forest Service. This is my colleague Vince D'Amico in the Forest Service, who initiated what's called the FRAME Forest Fragments and Managed Ecosystems project. And And the way that this project works is there are 38 forests in Newark and Philadelphia that Vince and his colleagues have been studying for about 10 or 12 years. And we've set up 12 of these frame sites in Raleigh that we've been studying for 4 or 5 years now. And in every one of these forests, we have complete plant and tree inventories. We have soil composition, soil analysis data, all kinds of data on litter depth and quality, arthropod diversity, birds, and invasive plant cover. And so these sites are very thoroughly studied, and all of these data are publicly available for researchers who want to use them. And for us, it works out well because we can, and other researchers can study and conduct research in these sites and have access to a lot of this background data that they don't have to collect themselves. So invasive plants and animals are a primary threat to forests, and often these threats are exacerbated by urbanization, fragmentation, and climate change. This is sort of the direction we're going to go today. We do have some work focused on invasive plants in these frame forests. Here's another map. This is of Newark, Delaware. And these yellowish forest fragments are some of the fragments that we study up there. My student Christina Mitchell has focused a lot on invasive plant species and how they affect forest quality for conservation. And so that's a different project, but if you're interested in that, I'll be glad to chat with you. Just shoot me an email. All right, so one of the things that we're super interested in is how climate can make native species invasive. And often invasive species, the first thing that comes to mind is exotic species that come from Asia or some other continent and wreak havoc here because they're non-native. But with climate change, we're seeing that more and more species, sometimes called sleeper species, become invasive pests just because of environmental change. And so an example is the mountain pine beetle and the southern pine beetle, which have expanded their range. These are native insects that have expanded their range and severity with a little bit of climate warming. And in Europe, the pine processionary moth here on the right-hand side of the screen is native to the Mediterranean region, but over the last several decades has sort of marched its way through all the way up to as far as Paris so far because of climate warming. And so again, it's native to the continent, but it has been able to spread and become invasive because of climate change. And so again, sometimes these are called sleeper species because they are essentially innocuous, sort of lying in wait for the climate to become advantageous. So one of the tricks in managing forests and other ecosystems is figuring out who are the sleeper species. If you consider even just one oak tree, like the one in this picture, it could have hundreds or even thousands of herbivore species on that one tree. And, obviously not all of these species are going to become damaging pests with climate change. Perhaps just one or two of them, but how do we figure out who are the sleeper species in any given ecosystem? And the approach that we've taken is to use cities and urban trees to predict the effects of climate change and to predict which arthropod pest species could become, or which arthropod herbivore species could become pests with climate change. And so cities have many conditions that are congruent with with climate change predictions, including higher temperatures, higher CO2 concentrations. And so we're looking at this as a way to predict invasive species that could affect rural forests as climate changes. One of the species we consider is this oak lecanium scale. The original work on this was done by a student of mine, Emily Meineke. She was a PhD student. She's actually at UC Davis now. And this is a native pest of oak trees in the US. And my former student, Larry, took up this work and took it to different geographic scales. So Larry studied these urban forest fragments. So in this picture, there's a big forest fragment here, and then next to it is some landscape trees. And Larry worked on the fragments and the landscape trees. And he conducted his work in Raleigh and in Newark, Delaware, again, using those frame sites. Okay, so Newark is 2.9 degrees cooler on average than Raleigh. And what Larry found was that his forest sites, the interior of the forest, was also about 2.5 degrees cooler than his landscape sites. So this allowed Larry to compare the effects of temperature on scale insects using both large scale geographic patterns, being a latitudinal difference of about 300 kilometers, and small scale temperature differences using forest interior and landscape trees that were about 50 meters away. Okay, and so the first thing to take from this is a pattern that we've seen before in our work, where the scale density on urban trees is much higher than on forest trees. And so in the red box here is the scale density in Raleigh, and you can see from the figure that scale density on the urban tree is much higher than on the forest tree. When we move to Newark in the north, scale density is also higher on urban trees, indicating that that 2.5 difference between forest and street trees is having some effect on scales in both locations, except we also see that, in part due to the difference in temperature between Raleigh and Newark, that Raleigh has higher scale density than Newark. And so this suggests that the urban heat island effect and latitudinal background temperature are affecting the density of this scale, and that as the climate becomes warmer and Newark looks more like Raleigh, that you could have more scales on forest trees in those locations. So to test this, Larry conducted another experiment where he created a common garden of oak trees in Raleigh. And we grew trees that were genotypes from Raleigh and Newark, and collected scale eggs in Raleigh and Newark to create a 2x2 factorial experiment here. And this way we could see if we warm Newark scales to Raleigh temperatures, which Newark will experience in 50 years or so, what's the response of those scales to that new environment? Okay, so we set up this big experiment out in the field. No easy feat. And we counted scales on, and all the people in my lab spend most of their life just counting all the time. Okay, here's what these look like. These are the the ovisacs of the lecanium scale on a heavily infested oak tree, and there's an Asian lady beetle feeding on those. Okay, so the consequence of bringing scales from the north and warming them to Raleigh temperatures is that they do great. And so what we end up with in the green bars are the northern scales that were grown on trees in Raleigh. And so those are the scales that were warmed to a new temperature. And you get far more scales from those Raleigh. Let me go back. The northern scales density increased much more than the southern scale density, indicating a response to a novel climate. And so we might expect then, as the climate warms, that as these scales encounter new temperatures, that they could become pests both in urban and rural forests. Pardon me. So another critter that we've used that I showed in a previous slide is gloomy scale, and that's these tiny bumps on this red maple. And a lot of this work was initiated by my former student, Adam Dale, who's at University of Florida now. And, you know, just to unfortunately reduce all of Adam's dissertation to one slide, we found that warming gloomy scale increases their survival, their fecundity, so they produce about 30% more eggs when the temperature is 2 degrees warmer, and they get about 30% larger when the temperature is warmer. And warming reduces biological control of scales. And as part of this project, we wanted to address the geographic range of this scale and whether it's increasing and becoming a pest in new areas due to warming. So we were lucky for gloomy scale to have a map from 1912 that outlined the distribution of this scale at that point. And this was a survey done by Dr. Metcalf, who actually was at NC State in 1912. And so this southeast distribution is gloomy scale distribution. Okay, within North Carolina, the black dots on this map indicate counties where Dr. Metcalf searched for scales and found them. And then out in the mountain regions, these open dots indicate that the county was searched for scales and no scales were found. And so out in these mountain regions, there were no gloomy scales, but in the rest of the state, there were gloomy scales. And Raleigh is here in Wake County in the Piedmont, gloomy scales in 1912. Asheville, for reference, is out here in the mountains in a county that did not have gloomy scales in 1912. Okay, so we did some experiments to figure out what limits the range of gloomy scale, and it comes down primarily to winter temperature. And this was work by Michael Just, who's a postdoc in my lab, and he did some field and laboratory experiments to determine that once you get below about -1 Celsius, scale survival declines pretty rapidly over time. And so in areas, you know, north of Virginia and out in the mountains where you get these cold temperatures with some regularity, gloomy scales don't survive. So if we take that in mind, now that we know that the distribution is temperature limited, as opposed to being limited by host plants or, you know, its primary host is red maple, which are everywhere up into Canada. So it's not a host plant limitation. It's a thermal limitation. And so here's Raleigh again. It had gloomy scales in 1912 and still has gloomy scales today. In Asheville, though, which has the size of Asheville has increased dramatically as an urban area, as a city in the last several decades. And what we find is that now, if you go to Asheville, in the downtown area where the urban heat island is the strongest, you can find lots of gloomy scales on trees downtown. If you go to the surrounding forest, so far we haven't found gloomy scales in the natural areas, suggesting that, you know, the urban heat island is providing a refuge for this species and allowing it to spread to a new geographic area out in the mountains, even though it hasn't yet been able to spread to the natural areas. Okay, and if we take this out even further, we've searched and worked with colleagues to search several places around the boundary, the former boundary of gloomy scale distribution, and we've found gloomy scale in cities in lots of places north of the former range. And so even as far north as Manhattan, we found gloomy scales on red maples in Manhattan, and in Ohio and Indianapolis, where we have some work going on. And so gloomy scales are moving and using cities as thermal refuge to expand their distribution northward. Now, presumably, once they become established in the cities, as the surrounding climate catches up, they would then be able to move into the rural forests, having already gained a foothold in the cities. And this is, I think, what we're seeing in Raleigh and other places. If you go to natural areas and rural forests here, you can find gloomy scale in those forests, whereas in 1912, gloomy scale was in Raleigh, but it was very uncommon in forests, and it seems to be becoming more common in rural forests and natural areas. So, you know, we've studied these two native species as sort of case studies for how environmental warming can activate sleeper species and make native species become invasive species through changes in phenotype, either genetic or plastic changes in phenotype, disconnecting these scales from their natural enemies, increasing their fecundity, and increasing their geographic range. So just in summary, we think forests are threatened by native and exotic invasive species, even though there's been a primary focus on exotic invasive species. But we think that cities could help expose which species will become invasive because they are warmer and they're exposing those critters to high temperatures decades before the surrounding climate catches up with them. You know, in sort of the opposite way, or in the same mechanism, but we've also found that the opposite can be true, where cities help us figure out which species will decline with climate change. We've studied pollinators and found that those native bees with the lowest thermal tolerance disappear from our warmest study sites, regardless of how many flowers or other resources are there. There's a clear temperature mechanism that reduces pollinator diversity based on species that can't tolerate those high temperatures. And so this can tell us, cities can tell us not only which species will thrive with climate change and maybe become pests, but also which species may decline and warrant additional conservation concern or preemptive management to preserve those species. Okay, so implications of some of this: identifying future invasive plants and animals allows managers to prepare for those. And so if we can predict which pests or diseases or plants will become invasive by studying cities, then managers north of those areas could prepare for those invasions years in advance. Urban forests expose heat-related changes in soil and ecosystem processes. So we're starting to do more work in soil processes and understanding carbon sequestration in soil and nitrification processes. And we also do a lot with photosynthesis and plant processes in these forests. So that's coming along. That's new work that we're trying to get going. And then, you know, we can predict habitat changes based on changes in soil moisture, plant cover, and plant responses to predict threats to species of conservation concern. Okay, the next, we're gonna change gears here and talk a bit about native and exotic trees. And when I give this talk, or this part of the talk, to arborists and landscapers and managers, I kind of call it the native plant paradox, because in some ways it goes against what people typically believe about native plants. And so if you just do a quick Google search, you'll find all kinds of things about native plants and why they are superior to exotic plants for use in ornamental landscapes, restoration, and other uses. But you can find all sorts of claims that native plants are adapted to local climates, that they're more resistant to pests, that they require less water and chemicals. You can find all kinds of craziness, that they even produce cleaner air and somehow save people money. And so native plants, among some parts of the public and professional groups, have taken on almost mystical powers in their ability to improve the environment. But some of these things are clearly not true, but others require some work. So, there's a revolution focused on native plants, and there's great books by, like this popular one by Dr. Talamy at University of Delaware, Bringing Nature Home, and I think he's got a couple of follow-up books to this. But essentially, if you plant native plants, they will support more herbivores like caterpillars, and that those herbivores will support other wildlife, particularly birds, and then also things like butterflies that people enjoy. And so, oaks, for instance, could have 530 species of caterpillars. And so it does get very, very high in terms of biodiversity. But, so in this sense, often herbivores are equated as bird food, not necessarily diversity in and of themselves. So the question could be asked, do we always want more herbivores? And this depends on the management goals of why people are installing trees what they want to come of those trees. So conservation of biodiversity, increasing plant diversity and native plants and arthropods and vertebrates are conservation goals that some managers or municipalities or even private citizens may have. Okay, lots of gorgeous caterpillars and things, and of course the birds that feed on them. But herbivores can also, as we saw in the last section, herbivores can also equal pests. And so having trees that support more herbivores may be a problem in some situations if your management goals are not strictly conservation oriented. And so if you are growing trees to try and extract services from those trees, such as atmospheric cooling, pollution reduction, shade, you might want trees that have actually fewer herbivores and that will thrive in some of these urban locations. But we don't really know the difference between how native and exotic trees perform in different situations. So over the last, 5 years, we've conducted several experiments comparing the sort of pitting conservation goals and pest density or tree management goals to see whether native and exotic trees can perform one or both of these goals better than the other. And so we've studied several native maples, including red maple, sugar maple, also silver maple, and some exotic maples, including Japanese maple, Norway maple, also trident maple in another experiment, native oaks, including willow oaks, white oaks, pin oaks, and exotic oaks. We really only have one to work with in Raleigh, which is the sawtooth oak. Okay, so we looked at pests on these trees, including scale insects and spider mites and other pests. And we also studied the arthropod diversity on these trees. And here's results of one of our experiments. The title sort of is the punchline here, where exotic urban trees can serve similar natural enemy communities to native congeners, but have fewer pests. And so the diversity of arthropods, the diversity of beneficial arthropods, so some of the predators and parasitoids that you see in the slides, was equal among native and exotic congeners. So the same value in conserving that arthropod diversity, except that the native species had more pests and were more susceptible to pest infestation and the damage that those pests cause. And so we took this work and did another experiment over a greater urbanization gradient, again comparing native and exotic maple congeners and native and exotic oak congeners, and found similar results, except with more detail here. So pests again became more abundant on native tree species compared to their exotic congeners as impervious surface increased. And so this is similar to what we've seen with our red maples and willow oaks, where as impervious surface increases and the urban heat island effect and drought increase, pests become more abundant. And that occurred on native trees, but not on the exotic trees, which maintained low pest abundance across the entire impervious surface gradient. And so since these trees are not as susceptible to pests in the first place, it didn't matter if they were in a high impervious area or a low impervious area. They had very few pests and maintained healthier growth and condition. Biodiversity on native and exotic trees. Arthropod diversity was equal in native and exotic trees at low impervious surface, as we saw in the previous experiment. But on native trees, arthropod diversity actually decreased as impervious surface increased. And so as urbanization, you know, the influence of impervious surface and temperature became stronger, the diversity on those native species decreased. And so essentially their conservation value became less. But on exotic trees, which started with similar arthropod diversity at low impervious surface, maintained more of that diversity as impervious surface increased. And so this kind of is in contrast, I think, to conventional wisdom that, you know, to achieve conservation goals, you always want to go with native species in urban and suburban plantings, because those native species are more susceptible to pests and may decline and lose some of their conservation value. And so in some cases, there may be a place for exotic species. Of course, we want exotic species that are not invasive, right? We don't want, there's no benefit in planting exotic species to conserve biodiversity if they're going to spread into natural areas and ruin biodiversity, right? So that's a caveat, of course. Okay, so in terms of planting for restoration or urban landscapes, the right tree in the right place is always a good axiom to consider. Natives are not always better for every location. And so, you know, the people suggest that native plants are adapted to the local environment, but in cities, no plants have evolved to live in cities, right? That cities are a novel environment for all species, whether they're geographically native or not. And so natives may be better in places that simulate the native condition in which they evolved. At high stress sites where you may be more concerned about providing services for people, such as shade and atmospheric cooling, the main thing to achieve those goals is to have trees that grow and thrive and have adequate physiological functioning to provide ecosystem services for people. And in those cases, especially high stress areas, exotic trees may provide more services. Okay, so changing gears again, you know, some of the emphasis, as I mentioned, on planting native trees and attracting arthropods to those trees is to support birds. I imagine there's some birders in the audience, and one of the questions that we had is, you know, if you plant a native tree with its accompanying native herbivores in a yard or a parking lot or a college campus, do the birds even visit those trees? You know, are those trees providing as much conservation value as trees in the forest? And so this was also work that Larry did Larry Long. And Larry compared bird community and bird foraging patterns on native trees throughout different urban conditions. And so in this long top panel here, there's forests out here to the left and then downtown areas to the right. And so Larry conducted his research in forests, again, using the frame sites that we have and adding some additional sites. And he used suburban areas, as in the middle panel, and also downtown areas. And Larry's an exceptional naturalist and birder. And so he was able to monitor willow oaks in 24 forests, 24 residential neighborhoods, and 24 downtown trees. Okay, he did point counts and again, lots of work where if you're interested in the details of this, we can discuss it another time. But the essence here, of course, downtown bird communities look about like this, primarily omnivores and granivores, often exotic species of those things. Residential bird communities, you get that same group of urban birds with a few additional species that are indicative of suburban communities, including robins and cowbirds and cardinals. And then in the urban forest communities, so these forest fragments that Larry studied, you actually get an extraordinary number of bird species. And so Larry came up with about 73 species of birds in these urban forest fragments. And if he monitored trees that were just 50 meters away from a forest fragment, you didn't get very many of these birds at all. It was only once you got into the fragment that you could pick up this diversity of species. Just 50 meters from the fragment, you had a basically suburban community. And in the fragment, then you had this great diversity of birds. And most of these birds are actually insectivores as opposed to granivores. The other thing that Larry did was to learn about their foraging activity. We put these plastic, they're made out of modeling clay, this plasticine modeling clay. We made hundreds of caterpillars out of this clay and glued them to trees in all the forests and street trees and suburban trees, and looked at how many times they were attacked by birds. And so attacks were much greater, much more frequent in the forest sites where you had a greater diversity of insectivorous birds. And the birds didn't forage very much on the residential and urban trees. So forests, even small forests in cities, are critical for birds and other diversity and serve a pretty valuable conservation role. And this role is increasing as forests are fragmented and urbanization increases. Warming and pests reduce photosynthesis, carbon sequestration and growth of urban trees. And preserving urban forests for people and for wildlife should be a priority, because urban forests do serve a valuable conservation function and also provide a lot of services to people. So that's what I've got for you, and I'll be glad to take any questions.
Thanks so much, Steve. Great talk. We probably have 5 minutes or so for questions. I have 2 already in the comments in the chat box. So I'm going to go ahead and start with that, and then other people can think on their comments. If you want to ask a question, you can unmute yourself by clicking the microphone button in the bottom left of your screen. That'll control your mute and unmute. And again, if we do have anyone who's joined us just by phone, *6 is the code to unmute your phone, or you can always continue to type your questions into the chat box. So one question, have there been studies done yet to evaluate the impact of sleeper species on native species?
Okay, there's been some work. There's with plants, there is a professor at Amherst who studies sleeper species, plant sleeper species. She's a great ecologist who studies invasive plants and actually works with the Northeast Climate Science Center up there. And so she's evaluating some of this with plants. In terms of insects, it's kind of a new approach where, you know, again, so much research has focused on exotic invasive species that it's only recently that we're really thinking about, you know, if an exotic species is one that lives in a place that it didn't evolve, as the climate changes, almost all species will be living under conditions in which they didn't evolve. And
Right.
so they either have to move to conditions more similar to where they evolved, or they're essentially kind of adapting and responding in the same way that exotic species might. And some exotic species fizzle out, some exotic species just become innocuous naturalized species, and some exotic species become damaging pests. And so I think we're going to encounter more of this with plants and animals as things change.
Great, thank you. And then another question from Kevin. Diversity of beneficial predators is shown to decrease on native trees in urban areas. What about the abundance of those beneficial predators?
So the abundance, that's an interesting question. The abundance is actually pretty similar among native and exotic congeners. And so, you know, we have data on abundance and richness, and then of course diversity indices. But the abundance is similar also, and part of this paradox is it is curious why they are all there. If the herbivores there are less herbivores, you know, whether it's scale insects or aphids or mites or whatever. These exotic trees have fewer herbivores, but they still manage to maintain a lot of predators and parasitoids. And so one of the things we'd like to do next is understand, you know, what resources, is it just shelter that's being provided? You know, are there other sources of food on there that we haven't considered? But it does sort of go against the conventional wisdom of why these trees have so many predators and parasitoids when the ratio to prey is so different.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I want to maybe just pause and see if anybody wants to jump in verbally with a question, and then I have one more in the chat box we can come back to.
Hi, this is Jim Gregory. Stephen, I've got a question about the forest fragments that y'all have been studying. Do you have a sense of the minimum size that would still have the expanded bird population and sort of the minimum temperature change in that urban heat island situation?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. This is one of the primary things we're trying to address with these fragments, and you know, and we'd love to have the resources to pursue it more, because we deliberately develop these fragments that range from about 2.5 hectares up to 50 or 100 hectares. And so we have a great range where we could compare the response of plants, animals, temperature, anything over a size continuum. And some of that data we're still processing, but some of it we still, there's a lot more that we could collect to try and determine at what point, at what size an urban forest looks like a rural forest. You know, there must be some curve of abiotic conditions and of, you know, pick a variable like diversity where, you know, at some size, a fragment looks like a larger intact forest. And so we don't have that yet. We're still working through, we have a whole nother batch of bird data. Larry has a job now, and so we're trying to get that sorted out as he has time and we have time. But and my student Christina is also considering this with her arthropod diversity in these forest fragments, and she's got a year or two to go. But that is a primary goal that we have to help. Some of this was initiated by discussions with Newark, and I met with folks in Charlotte before, where they have set-aside programs that developers have to either set aside a percentage of the land they develop or pay into a fund that the cities use to purchase natural areas to compensate for the development. And the problem they came to us with is that all this money is building up and no one knows how to spend it. Should they buy multiple small natural areas? Should they buy a couple of large ones on the outskirts of the city? And specifically, what size forest is kind of the minimum, you know, to have a functioning forest. And so anyways, that I kind of went on there for a while, but I appreciate your question because it is a key factor we're interested in.
Let me throw out something for you to think about. I'm retired from the Faculty of Forestry at NC State. I've been in Wilmington for 9 years, and I'm currently chair of the Wilmington Tree Commission.
Okay.
And the city is in the process of revising the development codes, and the tree protection ordinance is one that we'll be considering later this summer. And I keep harping on this issue of, rather than having, you know, 25 or 30 or 200 scattered small trees on a development site, let's save large forest fragments. And what I'm trying to encourage the people here to think about are small catchments to get the maximum impact of these preserved areas on stormwater runoff. And of course, that all of these issues would apply to bird populations and insect populations and everything else related to the ecosystem services of these fragments.
Yeah. Well, and you know, I'd be interested to hear more about what they're considering. If you want to shoot me an email or something, we can talk more.
Okay, good.
Offline. But I'm involved in the North Carolina Urban Tree Council, and so yeah, I think those groups have a lot of responsibility in making these decisions, and there's not enough data, you know, to really inform the decisions that municipalities across the country have to make, and we don't have the data to do it.
Well, thanks so much for that question and that response, Steve. I do need to wrap things up just for time since we've hit 11 o'clock. I wanted to make sure people knew what to expect for the next few months of webinars that we have scheduled next month. We'll be getting back together on the third Thursday of May. That's May 21st at 10 a.m. Eastern. It'll also be via Zoom, via this information that's available on the Success Series website at the bottom of this slide. We'll be hearing from Mitch Eaton with the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, and he's going to be talking about climate change adaptation for coastal national wildlife refuges. And so we'll be continuing to to post these webinars, the connection information and the description at the 6S series website at the bottom, as well as on the South Atlantic LCC website. Those events will be on the homepage. So we really hope that you'll continue to join us for the rest of this series. And that's all I have. Thanks again, Steve, for this talk.
Sure thing. My pleasure.
Appreciate you guys tuning in. If people do want to hang out and ask a couple more questions, I don't mind leaving the line open if you don't mind hanging out, Steve, but I just wanted to make sure that we did a quick preview of Mitch's talk for next week.
Yeah, I've got a minute, then another Zoom meeting. So,
fair enough.
If a couple quick questions, I'll be glad to engage them.
Anybody else want to chime in before we hang up the phone here?
Hey, Steve, if you have a quick, this is Carrie, just a quick question. So how can, based on this, this huge number of species that you pointed out, on a common oak tree in urban areas, how can we be strategic about studying this huge number that are maybe candidates for, sleeper species status?
Well, I think, observing which species are already doing well. And so, the maple and oak trees that we've studied the most, each have 10 or 15 different scale species, but only one has really become, has responded in this way. And so the other species on red maples or on oaks, stay at low densities or non-pests, even on urban trees. And it's really only the gloomy scale on maples and the lecanium scale on oaks that has responded this way. And so by observing these, the pests that we see in urban areas, and then doing the work to be sure that it's a heat-related phenomenon, I think helps us identify those species somewhat efficiently.
Makes sense. Anybody else? All right, well, I'll let everybody get on with the rest of their morning. Thanks again, Steve. Thanks, Carrie and Ashlyn, and appreciate you all tuning in. Hope you'll join us in May. Have a great rest of your day.
Sure, thanks everybody.
Yep, thanks.
Bye.